The woman at the coffee shop counter whispered just loud enough for me to hear. "Look at her outfit. Does she even own a mirror?" Her friend giggled and added, "Seriously, she looks like she just crawled out from under a bridge. How embarrassing." They were talking about me, of course, standing there in my faded jeans with the small tear at the knee, my oversized sweater that had seen better days, and my worn sneakers that I'd owned for 3 years. What they didn't know was that every single word they spoke was being recorded by the tiny device hidden in my seemingly cheap purse, and that I already knew more about their lives than they could possibly imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Chen, and for the past 5 years, I've been working as a private investigator in the wealthy suburb of Millbrook Heights. But irony wasn't lost on me that my success in this field came largely from my ability to blend into the background, to be so unremarkable that people forgot I was even there. What started as a survival mechanism during my childhood and foster care had become my greatest professional asset. People see what they expect to see, and what they expected when they looked at me was someone beneath their notice. The coffee shop incident happened on a Tuesday morning in September. I was there conducting surveillance on Rebecca Hartwell, the wife of a prominent local businessman who suspected she was having an affair. What I hadn't expected was to recognize the two women making comments about my appearance. The blonde one with the perfectly styled hair and designer handbag was Miranda Walsh, married to Judge Thomas Walsh. The brunette in the Chanel suit was Vivian Cross, wife of Police Chief David Cross. Both women were pillars of Millbrook Heights society, known for their charity work and social connections. I'd been tracking Rebecca for 3 weeks, documenting her daily routines, her lunch meetings, her shopping trips. The case seemed straightforward until I noticed something odd. Rebecca wasn't having an affair at all. Instead, she was meeting with a private accountant every Tuesday and Thursday at various locations around town. The meetings were brief, always involving the exchange of documents, and Rebecca seemed nervous every time. As I sat in my corner booth, sipping my black coffee and pretending to read a paperback novel, I watched Rebecca enter the coffee shop. She looked around nervously before spotting someone at a table near the window. The person she was meeting surprised me. It was Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the town's most respected pediatrician and wife of the mayor. Rebecca slid into the seat across from Dr. Morrison, and I could see the tension in both women's postures. Miranda and Vivian were still making snide comments about my wardrobe when Rebecca and Dr. Morrison began their conversation. I adjusted the small listening device I'd planted on the table next to theirs during my reconnaissance the previous week. The conversation that followed would change everything. "The numbers don't add up, Elizabeth," Rebecca was saying quietly. "I've been over the charity books 3 times. There's nearly $200,000 missing from the Children's Foundation account." Dr. Morrison's face went pale. "Are you absolutely certain? Maybe there's a mistake in the accounting." "I wish there was," Rebecca replied, sliding a folder across the table, "but I've traced the transactions. The money was moved to 3 different offshore accounts over the past 18 months. Someone with administrative access has been systematically stealing from the foundation." I felt my pulse quicken. The Millbrook Heights Children's Foundation was one of the most prestigious charities in the area. It funded local school programs, provided medical care for underprivileged children, and sponsored community events. The idea that someone was embezzling from such an organization was shocking. Dr. Morrison opened the folder and began studying the documents. "These account numbers, do you know who they belong to?" "That's what I need your help with, Rebecca. As the Foundation's medical coordinator, you have access to the board member database. I need to cross-reference these account numbers with the personal financial information we have on file." Meanwhile, Miranda and Vivian had finished their disparaging commentary about my wardrobe and moved on to gossiping about other people in town. I was only half listening to them when I heard something that made my blood run cold. "Did you see the thank you note in the newspaper from the Children's Foundation?" Vivian was saying. "They're so grateful for all the community support."
"Tom and I wrote them another check last month." Miranda laughed. "David and I did the same thing. Though between you and me, I sometimes wonder where all that money actually goes. These charity organizations can be so inefficient. The irony was staggering. Here were two women unknowingly sitting within earshot of a conversation about missing charity funds, while simultaneously complaining about the appearance of someone they assumed was beneath their social status. What they didn't know was that I'd been building files on both their families for months. My investigation into Rebecca Hartwell had actually been a cover for a much larger case. 6 months ago, I'd been hired by an anonymous client to investigate potential corruption in Millbrook Heights local government. The retainer was substantial, paid through an offshore account, and the only instruction was to document any suspicious financial activity involving city officials and their families. What I discovered was far more extensive than I'd initially imagined. Judge Walsh had been accepting bribes in exchange for favorable rulings in civil cases. Police Chief Cross was taking payments from local drug dealers in exchange for advance warning about raids. Mayor Morrison was skimming money from city contracts and funneling it into personal investment accounts. And now it appeared that charity embezzlement was also part of the corruption network. I'd been documenting everything meticulously. Bank records, meeting schedules, phone conversations, email exchanges. My small apartment was filled with filing cabinets containing evidence that could destroy half the power structure in Millbrook Heights. The challenge had been finding a way to connect all the dots and understand the full scope of the corruption. Rebecca's discovery about the missing charity funds might be the missing piece I needed. As I continued to observe the two women's meeting, I noticed something else. Dr. Morrison kept glancing nervously toward the coffee shop entrance, as if she was expecting someone. Her hands were trembling slightly as she reviewed the financial documents, and she seemed more frightened than surprised by Rebecca's revelations. "Elizabeth, there's something else," Rebecca continued, lowering her voice even further. "I think whoever is taking this money knows that I've been investigating. Yesterday, I found my office door unlocked when I was certain I'd locked it. Someone had gone through my desk." Dr. Morrison's face went even paler. "Rebecca, maybe you should stop digging into this. If someone knows you're investigating, you could be in danger." "I can't stop now," Rebecca replied firmly. "This money was supposed to help children, sick children, children from poor families who need medical care. Whoever is stealing it is literally taking medicine out of children's mouths." I felt a surge of respect for Rebecca Hartwell. Her husband had hired me to investigate her suspected infidelity, but instead I'd discovered that she was risking her personal safety to expose charity fraud. The irony wasn't lost on me that her husband's suspicions were completely unfounded, while his wife was actually engaged in something far more dangerous than an affair. Miranda and Vivian were preparing to leave when I heard Miranda say something that made me pay closer attention to their conversation. "Speaking of charity work, are you going to the foundation gala next week? Tom is being honored for his years of service to the community." Vivian smiled. "Of course. David is also receiving an award for his partnership with local youth programs. It's so wonderful to see our husbands getting recognition for their civic contributions." I almost choked on my coffee. These women were talking about their husbands receiving awards for community service, while their husbands were actually corrupt officials stealing from the very community they claimed to serve. The level of irony was almost too much to process. As Miranda and Vivian left the coffee shop, still making occasional comments about other people's appearances and perceived social status, I realized that I was sitting on a goldmine of information. Not only did I have evidence of their husband's corruption, but I now also had documentation of their own attitudes toward people they considered beneath them. Rebecca and Dr. Morrison concluded their meeting with plans to continue investigating the missing funds. Dr. Morrison agreed to provide Rebecca with access to the board member database, and they scheduled another meeting for the following week. As they prepared to leave, I noticed Dr. Morrison slip Rebecca a small envelope. "Be careful," Dr. Morrison whispered.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
If my suspicions are correct about who's behind this, you're dealing with people who have a lot to lose.
After both women left, I remained in the coffee shop for another hour, processing what I'd learned. The missing charity funds were clearly connected to the broader corruption network I'd been investigating. The timing was too coincidental, and the nervous behavior of both women suggested that they understood the stakes involved. That evening, in my apartment, I spread out all my files on the dining room table. Financial records, surveillance photos, recorded conversations, email printouts. The evidence painted a clear picture of systematic corruption involving multiple city officials and their families. Judge Walsh, Police Chief Cross, Mayor Morrison, and now the Children's Foundation board members were all connected in a web of fraud and embezzlement. What struck me most was how these people maintained their respectable facades while engaging in criminal behavior. They attended charity galas, received community service awards, and looked down on people like me, who they perceived as lower class. Meanwhile, they were stealing from the very causes they claimed to support. I thought about Miranda and Vivian's comments about my appearance. They saw my worn clothing and assumed I was homeless or indigent. They couldn't imagine that the woman they were mocking actually possessed information that could destroy their comfortable lives. Their prejudice and arrogance had made them careless, and their carelessness would ultimately be their downfall. The next morning, I received a call from my anonymous client. The voice was electronically disguised, as always, but the message was clear. Have you made progress on the Millbrook Heights investigation? Significant progress, I replied. I've documented corruption involving the judge, police chief, mayor, and now charity embezzlement. The evidence is substantial. Good. Continue gathering information. We'll need everything to be ironclad before we proceed. Can I ask who you are and why you want this information? There was a long pause before the response. Let's just say I'm someone who believes in justice and accountability. Millbrook Heights has been corrupt for too long, and it's time for that to change. The call ended, leaving me with more questions than answers. Who was my client? How did they know about the corruption? And what exactly did they plan to do with the evidence I was gathering? Over the following days, I continued my surveillance and investigation. I documented Judge Walsh accepting an envelope full of cash from a defense attorney in a parking garage. I photographed Police Chief Cross meeting with known drug dealers at a warehouse outside town. I recorded Mayor Morrison discussing kickback payments from construction companies bidding on city contracts. Each piece of evidence added to the growing picture of corruption, but I still needed to understand how the charity embezzlement fit into the larger scheme. That answer came sooner than I expected. On Friday afternoon, I was conducting surveillance at City Hall when I saw something that connected all the dots. Dr. Morrison was entering the building through a side entrance carrying a briefcase. She went directly to the mayor's office, staying for approximately 30 minutes before leaving through the same side entrance. I followed her to a bank downtown, where she made a deposit at a customer service window rather than using an ATM. The transaction took several minutes and involved multiple documents. When she left the bank, she no longer had the briefcase. That evening, I reviewed my notes and realized what was happening. Dr. Morrison wasn't just reporting the missing charity funds. She was part of the embezzlement scheme. Her nervous behavior during the meeting with Rebecca was fear of being caught by Rebecca's investigation. The Children's Foundation money was being funneled through a network that included the mayor, his wife, and several other prominent community members. They were stealing from sick children to fund their own lavish lifestyles and corrupt activities. I felt sick to my stomach as I processed this information. These people were stealing from the most vulnerable members of society while maintaining their respectable public images. They attended charity galas, received community service awards, and looked down on people like me who they perceived as lower class. Meanwhile, they were stealing from the very causes they claimed to support. I thought about Miranda and Vivian's comments about my appearance. They saw my worn clothing and assumed I was homeless or indigent. They couldn't imagine that the woman they were mocking
actually possessed information that could destroy their comfortable lives. Their prejudice and arrogance had made them careless, and their carelessness would ultimately be their downfall. On Monday morning, I received another call from my anonymous client. The voice was electronically disguised, as always, but the message was clear. "Have you made progress on the Millbrook Heights investigation?" "Significant progress," I replied. "I've documented corruption involving the judge, police chief, mayor, and now charity embezzlement. The evidence is substantial." "Good. Continue gathering information. We'll need everything to be ironclad before we proceed." "Can I ask who you are and why you want this information?" There was a long pause before the response. "Let's just say I'm someone who believes in justice and accountability. Millbrook Heights has been corrupt for too long, and it's time for that to change."
The call ended, leaving me with more questions than answers. Who was my client? How did they know about the corruption? And what exactly did they plan to do with the evidence I was gathering? Over the following days, I continued my surveillance and investigation. I documented Judge Walsh accepting an envelope full of cash from a defense attorney in a parking garage. I photographed Police Chief Cross meeting with known drug dealers at a warehouse outside town. I recorded Mayor Morrison discussing kickback payments from construction companies bidding on city contracts. Each piece of evidence added to the growing picture of corruption, but I still needed to understand how the charity embezzlement fit into the larger scheme. That answer came sooner than I expected. On Friday afternoon, I was conducting surveillance at City Hall when I saw something that connected all the dots. Dr. Morrison was entering the building through a side entrance, carrying a briefcase. She went directly to the mayor's office, staying for approximately 30 minutes before leaving through the same side entrance. I followed her to a bank downtown where she made a deposit at a customer service window rather than using an ATM. The transaction took several minutes and involved multiple documents. When she left the bank, she no longer had the briefcase. That evening, I reviewed my notes and realized what was happening. Dr. Morrison wasn't just reporting the missing charity funds, she was part of the embezzlement scheme. Her nervous behavior during the meeting with Rebecca wasn't fear of the criminals, it was fear of being caught by Rebecca's investigation. The Children's Foundation money was being funneled through a network that included the mayor, his wife, and several other prominent community members. They were stealing from sick children to fund their own lavish lifestyles and corrupt activities. I felt sick to my stomach as I processed this information. These people were stealing from the most vulnerable members of society while maintaining their respectable public images. They attended charity galas and received community service awards for their contributions to the very causes they were robbing. The weekend gave me time to organize all my evidence and prepare for whatever my anonymous client had planned. I created detailed files for each corrupt official, including financial records, surveillance photos, recorded conversations, and documentary evidence. The scope of the corruption was staggering, involving millions of dollars and affecting virtually every aspect of Millbrook Heights government and charitable organizations. On Monday morning, I received another call from my client. "Are you ready to proceed to the next phase?" "I have everything documented," I replied. "Financial fraud, bribery, embezzlement, conspiracy. The evidence is overwhelming." "Good. There's going to be a charity gala this Saturday evening at the Millbrook Heights Country Club. All the corrupt officials will be there, along with their families. I want you to attend." "Attend? I'm a private investigator, not a socialite. I won't fit in at that kind of event." "That's exactly why you're perfect for this. No one will pay attention to you. You'll be invisible, just like you've been throughout this investigation." The client was right. My unremarkable appearance and ability to blend into the background had been my greatest asset throughout this case. At a high society charity gala, I would be just another server or staff member to most attendees. What do you want me to do at the gala? Document everything. Take photos, record conversations,
gather evidence, but most importantly, be ready to deliver justice when the time comes. What do you mean, deliver justice? You'll understand on Saturday night. Just be prepared. The call ended, leaving me with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. After months of gathering evidence and watching corrupt officials steal from their community, I was finally going to see justice served. But I still didn't know who my client was or exactly what they had planned. I spent the week preparing for the gala. I purchased a simple black dress and basic accessories that would allow me to blend in with the catering staff. I tested all my recording equipment and charged my camera batteries. Most importantly, I organized all my evidence files so I could access any information quickly if needed. Saturday evening arrived faster than I expected. The Millbrook Heights Country Club was decorated with elegant flowers and sparkling lights. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway, and well-dressed guests mingled on the terrace overlooking the golf course. It was exactly the kind of high society event where corrupt officials could congratulate themselves on their community service while secretly planning their next fraudulent scheme. I entered through the service entrance as my anonymous client had instructed. The catering supervisor didn't question my presence. She simply handed me a tray of appetizers and pointed toward the main ballroom. As I moved through the crowd, serving canapes and collecting empty glasses, I was struck by how invisible I truly was to these people. Judge Walsh was holding court near the bar, regaling a group of admirers with stories about his years of public service. Police Chief Cross was schmoozing with local business leaders, discussing community safety initiatives. Mayor Morrison and his wife were accepting congratulations for their charitable work, particularly their involvement with the Children's Foundation. The irony was overwhelming. These criminals were being celebrated for their contributions to the very community they were systematically robbing. They wore expensive clothing, drove luxury cars, and lived in mansions, all funded by money stolen from city budgets and charitable organizations. As the evening progressed, I documented everything with my hidden cameras and recording devices. Conversations about upcoming construction contracts that would involve kickback payments, discussions about legal cases where favorable rulings could be purchased, plans for future charity events that would provide more opportunities for embezzlement. Miranda Walsh and Vivian Cross were in attendance, of course, dressed in designer gowns and dripping with jewelry. They moved through the crowd like royalty, accepting compliments on their husbands' achievements and their own charitable contributions. At one point, Vivian actually thanked me for refilling her champagne glass, but she looked right through me as if I were invisible. Around 9 o'clock, something unexpected happened. The lights in the ballroom dimmed, and a spotlight illuminated the stage where a podium had been set up. Mayor Morrison approached the microphone to address the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for attending tonight's gala supporting the Millbrook Heights Children's Foundation. Your generosity helps ensure that every child in our community has access to medical care, educational opportunities, and a brighter future. The crowd applauded enthusiastically, completely unaware that the very foundation they were supporting had been systematically robbed by the people they were applauding. Mayor Morrison continued his speech, introducing the evening's honorees. Judge Walsh was recognized for his years of legal service to the community. Police Chief Cross received an award for his partnership with local youth programs. Dr. Morrison was honored for her medical contributions to the Children's Foundation.
Each honoree gave a brief speech about their commitment to public service and community welfare. The audience listened respectfully, occasionally applauding when particularly inspiring points were made. It was a perfect display of civic pride and charitable spirit. What happened next changed everything. As Dr. Morrison concluded her acceptance speech and prepared to leave the stage, the lights suddenly came up to full brightness. A new voice spoke over the sound system, electronically disguised but clearly audible throughout the ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this evening's celebration of community service and charitable giving. Unfortunately, I have some disturbing information to share about the people you've been honoring tonight. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. Mayor Morrison tried to regain control of the microphone, but it had been disconnected. Security personnel looked around frantically, trying to locate the source of the mysterious announcement. The Millbrook Heights Children's Foundation that you've been supporting tonight has been the victim of systematic embezzlement. Over the past 18 months, nearly $200,000 has been stolen from accounts intended to provide medical care for sick children. The murmur in the crowd grew louder. People began looking around nervously, trying to understand what was happening. But that's not all. Your honored guests tonight, Judge Thomas Walsh, Police Chief David Cross, and Mayor Richard Morrison are all involved in a corruption network that has been stealing from this community for years. Judge Walsh's face had gone completely white. Police Chief Cross was frantically speaking into his radio, trying to coordinate a response. Mayor Morrison was attempting to leave the stage, but the doors had been locked. The evidence of their crimes has been meticulously documented by a private investigator who has been working undercover in this community for months. Someone you've all seen but never noticed. Someone whose appearance you've mocked and whose presence you've ignored. I felt every eye in the room searching the crowd, but no one was looking at the woman in the simple black dress holding a tray of empty glasses. Tonight, justice will finally be served. Federal agents are already in position outside this building. Arrest warrants have been issued based on evidence of bribery, embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. The corruption that has plagued Millbrook Heights for years is about to end. The ballroom erupted into chaos as the reality of the situation began to sink in. I watched from my position near the service station as federal agents in dark suits entered through multiple entrances, their badges clearly visible as they moved purposefully through the crowd. The guests, who moments before had been celebrating community service and charitable giving, now stood frozen in shock and confusion. Judge Walsh attempted to push through the crowd toward an emergency exit, but found his path blocked by Agent Martinez, a woman I recognized from surveillance photos in my files. She had been investigating municipal corruption in surrounding counties for the past 2 years, and my anonymous client had been feeding information to the federal task force. Miranda Walsh's perfectly composed facade cracked as she watched her husband being approached by federal agents. Her champagne glass slipped from her manicured fingers, shattering on the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet ballroom. The woman who had mocked my appearance just days earlier now stood trembling in her designer gown, watching her world collapse around her. Police Chief Cross was frantically trying to coordinate with his officers through his radio, but the responses he received made it clear that the federal operation had been planned with precision. His own department had been kept in the dark about the investigation, and several of his senior officers were also under surveillance. The man who had built his reputation on law and order was now discovering that the law was about to hold him accountable for his crimes. Vivian Cross grabbed her husband's arm desperately, her voice carrying across the ballroom as she demanded to know what was happening. The composed socialite, who had judged me for my worn clothing, now looked disheveled and panicked, her carefully styled hair coming undone as she shook her husband's shoulders. Mayor Morrison remained on the stage, apparently paralyzed by the magnitude of what was unfolding. His wife, Dr. Morrison, had disappeared into the crowd, presumably trying to find an escape route that didn't exist. The federal agents had clearly planned for every contingency, and the building was completely surrounded. Agent Martinez approached the podium and took control of the sound system. Her voice was calm and professional as she addressed the confused crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Special Agent Martinez with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are executing arrest warrants for several individuals present tonight in connection with the federal investigation into municipal corruption, charity fraud, and racketeering. Please remain calm and follow the instructions of federal agents and local law enforcement. The crowd began to murmur anxiously as people processed the implications of what they were hearing. Many of the guests were prominent community members who had no involvement in the corruption, but were now witnessing the arrest of people they had respected and trusted.
I continued to move through the crowd, my server's uniform providing perfect camouflage as the real drama unfolded around me. My recording devices were capturing everything, documenting the moment when years of careful investigation finally culminated in justice. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same invisibility that had allowed me to gather evidence was now protecting me as I witnessed the consequences of that evidence. Agent Rodriguez, another federal investigator I recognized from my files, approached Judge Walsh with a warrant in hand. Judge Thomas Walsh, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit bribery, wire fraud, and violation of federal racketeering statutes. The judge's face went through a range of emotions as the charges were read: shock, denial, anger, and finally a kind of resigned defeat as the handcuffs clicked into place.
The man who had spent decades presiding over a courtroom was now experiencing the justice system from the other side. Miranda Walsh let out a strangled cry as her husband was led away. She stumbled after them, her high heels catching on her gown as she tried to keep up with the federal agents. "This is a mistake," she kept repeating. "Tom is a respected judge. He's dedicated his life to justice." What she didn't know was that I had recordings of her husband accepting bribes, photographs of him meeting with criminals, and financial records showing unexplained deposits into offshore accounts. The respect and dedication she spoke of were carefully constructed lies that had hidden years of corruption. Police Chief Cross was surrounded by 3 federal agents as Agent Thompson read him his rights. "David Cross, you are under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, obstruction of justice, and violation of federal racketeering statutes." The charges seemed to echo through the ballroom, each one representing months of documented criminal activity. Vivian Cross collapsed into a nearby chair, her face buried in her hands as she sobbed uncontrollably. The woman who had judged me for looking homeless was now facing the prospect of her husband spending decades in federal prison. Her comfortable life of charity galas and social events was about to become a nightmare of legal fees, public humiliation, and financial ruin. Mayor Morrison finally attempted to leave the stage, but Agent Martinez blocked his path. "Mayor Richard Morrison, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, embezzlement of federal funds, and violation of federal racketeering statutes." The mayor's arrest was particularly dramatic because he had been at the podium when the operation began. The entire ballroom watched as the man who had been celebrating his community service just minutes earlier was handcuffed and led away by federal agents. Dr. Morrison emerged from the crowd, her face ashen as she realized there was no escape. Agent Williams approached her with a separate warrant. "Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit charity fraud, money laundering, and violation of federal racketeering statutes." The pediatrician who had built her reputation on caring for children was now being arrested for stealing money intended to provide medical care for those same children. The betrayal was particularly egregious because she had used her position of trust to facilitate the embezzlement scheme. As the arrests continued, I noticed something remarkable happening among the guests. Many of them were beginning to piece together details they had previously overlooked. Conversations that had seemed innocent now took on sinister meanings. Expensive purchases that couldn't be explained by legitimate salaries. Sudden wealth that had no apparent source. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who had donated thousands of dollars to the Children's Foundation, was crying as she realized her money had been stolen rather than used to help sick children. "I gave them my late husband's life insurance money," she whispered to her companion. "I thought it was going to buy medical equipment for the pediatric ward." Mr. Johnson, a local business owner, was staring at Judge Walsh in disbelief. "I appeared before him in court last year. I lost a case that should have been a slam dunk. I wonder if the other side paid him off." The domino effect was beginning as people realized that the corruption had likely touched their own lives in ways they were only now beginning to understand. Legal cases that had unexpected outcomes, city contracts that went to unqualified bidders, charity donations that seemed to disappear without making any visible impact.
As the primary arrests were completed, Agent Martinez addressed the crowd again. The investigation that led to tonight's arrests was made possible by an undercover private investigator who spent months gathering evidence of the criminal conspiracy. This individual risked their safety to document crimes that were stealing from your community and betraying your trust. I felt a chill of anticipation as hundreds of eyes scanned the crowd looking for the mysterious investigator who had brought down their corrupt officials. They were looking for someone dramatic, someone obvious, someone who looked like their idea of a private detective. They weren't looking at the unremarkable woman in the server's uniform who had been refilling their drinks and clearing their plates all evening. Agent Martinez continued. The evidence gathered includes financial records, recorded conversations, surveillance photographs, and documentary proof of systematic corruption involving millions of dollars stolen from city budgets and charitable organizations. The scope of the corruption was finally becoming clear to the guests. This wasn't just a few isolated incidents of misconduct. It was a coordinated criminal enterprise that had been operating for years, stealing from the very people these officials had sworn to serve. Detective Sarah Chen. The name echoed through the ballroom as Agent Martinez called me forward. The crowd parted as I walked toward the stage, removing my server's apron and revealing my true identity. The transformation was subtle but significant. I was no longer the invisible background figure they had overlooked all evening. The gasps of recognition from Miranda Walsh and Vivian Cross were audible throughout the ballroom. These were the women who had mocked my appearance, dismissed me as homeless, and treated me as beneath their notice.
Now they were realizing that the person they had belittled possessed evidence that would destroy their families. Detective Chen has been working undercover for the past 6 months, Agent Martinez explained, gathering evidence that revealed the full scope of this criminal conspiracy. Her investigation documented systematic theft from city budgets, charity fraud involving the Children's Foundation, judicial corruption, and police misconduct. I stepped up to the podium, looking out at the crowd of shocked faces. Many of these people were innocent victims of the corruption, donors who had given generously to causes they believed in only to discover their money had been stolen. Others were complicit in various ways, turning blind eyes to obvious irregularities or benefiting from the corrupt system without asking questions. My investigation began 6 months ago when I was hired to look into suspected financial irregularities in city government, I began, my voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. What I discovered was far more extensive than anyone imagined. I pulled out a folder containing some of the key evidence I had gathered. Financial records showing millions of dollars in unexplained transfers. Photographs of secret meetings between city officials and known criminals. Recordings of conversations where bribes were negotiated and criminal activities planned. Judge Walsh accepted over $300,000 in bribes over the past 2 years, I continued, watching Miranda Walsh's face crumble as the full extent of her husband's corruption became public. He sold favorable rulings to the highest bidder, corrupting the very foundation of our justice system. The evidence against Judge Walsh was overwhelming. Bank records showing deposits that coincided with favorable rulings, recorded conversations where he explicitly negotiated the price of judicial decisions, surveillance footage of him accepting envelopes of cash in parking garages and restaurants. Police Chief Cross took payments from drug dealers in exchange for advance warning about raids and investigations, I said, turning toward where Vivian Cross sat, sobbing. He also accepted bribes to influence the outcomes of criminal investigations, allowing dangerous criminals to escape justice. The corruption in the police department ran deep. Cross had been selling information about ongoing investigations, warning criminals about impending arrests, and manipulating evidence to benefit his criminal associates. The man entrusted with public safety had been one of the greatest threats to that safety. Mayor Morrison and his wife embezzled nearly $400,000 from city budgets and charitable organizations, I continued, documenting the scope of their financial crimes. They used their positions of trust to steal money intended for infrastructure improvements, social services, and medical care for children. The Morrison embezzlement scheme was particularly sophisticated. They had created false invoices, manipulated accounting records, and established offshore accounts to hide their stolen money. The Children's Foundation was just one of several charitable organizations they had targeted. But the corruption goes beyond these three officials, I said, preparing to reveal the broader network I had uncovered. My investigation revealed a systematic criminal enterprise involving multiple city departments, several charitable organizations, and numerous private contractors. The silence in the ballroom was complete as people processed the magnitude of what I was revealing. This wasn't just about a few corrupt individuals. It was about a criminal network that had infected multiple levels of local government and nonprofit organizations. I began detailing the evidence methodically, the same way I had gathered it over months of careful investigation. Financial records showing how city contracts were rigged to benefit specific companies in exchange for kickback payments. Documentation of how charity donations were diverted to personal accounts. Proof of how judicial decisions were influenced by bribery and corruption. The investigation also revealed that several prominent community members knowingly benefited from this corruption. I continued, watching as some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Construction companies that paid bribes for city contracts, law firms that paid judges for favorable rulings, businesses that paid police officials for protection from prosecution. The web of corruption was extensive, involving not just the primary targets, but also numerous businesses and individuals who had participated in or benefited from the criminal conspiracy. Some of these people were in the audience tonight, realizing that their own criminal activity had also been documented. Agent Martinez stepped forward to address the crowd again. Tonight's arrests are just the beginning of this investigation. Federal grand jury indictments will be issued in the coming weeks for additional individuals involved in this criminal conspiracy. The message was clear. Anyone who had participated in the corruption network should expect to face criminal charges. The federal investigation was far from over, and more arrests would follow as prosecutors worked their way through the evidence I had gathered. I looked out at the crowd, seeing the faces of people whose comfortable assumptions about their community had been shattered in a single evening. The wealthy socialites who had judged me for my appearance now understood that I had been documenting their families' criminal activities. The business leaders who had participated in corrupt schemes now faced federal prosecution. The charitable donors who had trusted their money to corrupt officials now knew their generosity had been betrayed. Miranda Walsh was staring at me with a mixture of shock and hatred. The woman who had mocked my clothing and suggested that I looked like homeless now realized that I had evidence that would send her husband to federal prison for decades. Her privileged life was about to become a nightmare of legal proceedings, media attention, and financial ruin. Vivian Cross had stopped crying and was now looking at me with something approaching disbelief. She couldn't comprehend how someone she had dismissed as beneath her notice had been systematically documenting her husband's crimes. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming as she tried to reconcile her prejudices with reality. Other guests were having similar realizations. The person they had overlooked, ignored, or looked down upon had actually been the most dangerous person in the room. My unremarkable appearance and low-key presence had made me invisible to them, allowing me to document their secrets and criminal activities without being detected. Agent Martinez approached the podium again. Detective Chen will now present a summary of the evidence that led to tonight's arrests. This information is being made public to ensure transparency in the investigation and to help the community understand the scope of the corruption that has been uncovered. I opened my evidence folders and began presenting the documented proof of the criminal conspiracy. Bank records showing unexplained wealth accumulation by city officials. Photographs of secret meetings between public servants and known criminals. Audio recordings of conversations where bribes were negotiated and criminal activities planned. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Years of systematic corruption, millions of dollars in stolen money, and a criminal network that had infected virtually every level of local government.
The scope of the betrayal was staggering, especially for a community that had prided itself on civic virtue and charitable giving. The Children's Foundation alone lost over $600,000 to embezzlement, I explained, watching as Dr. Morrison's former supporters realized the extent of her betrayal. Money donated by community members to provide medical care for sick children was instead used to fund personal luxury purchases and investment accounts. The pediatrician's crimes were particularly heinous because they involved stealing from the most vulnerable members of society. Children who needed medical care had been denied treatment because the money intended to help them had been diverted to offshore accounts controlled by corrupt officials. City infrastructure projects were inflated by millions of dollars to generate kickback payments, I continued, documenting how the corruption had affected every aspect of municipal government. Roads that should have cost $50,000 were billed at $200,000, with the difference split between corrupt officials and complicit contractors. The infrastructure corruption explained why so many public works projects in Millbrook Heights had been delayed, over budget, or poorly constructed. The officials responsible for overseeing these projects had been more interested in generating personal profit than ensuring quality work for the community. Judicial corruption affected dozens of legal cases over the past 3 years, I said, turning to evidence involving Judge Walsh's criminal activities. Civil lawsuits, criminal prosecutions, family court decisions, and business disputes were all influenced by bribery and corruption rather than legal merit. The implications for the justice system were staggering. Every case that had appeared before Judge Walsh during his period of corruption would now need to be reviewed for potential judicial misconduct. Innocent people may have been convicted while guilty parties escaped justice through bribery. As I continued presenting evidence, I noticed that some guests were beginning to leave the ballroom. Whether they were fleeing potential implication in the corruption or simply couldn't bear to hear more devastating revelations, the crowd was gradually thinning as the scope of the criminal conspiracy became clear. Agent Martinez announced that federal prosecutors would be available to speak with anyone who had information about the corruption or who believed they had been victimized by the criminal conspiracy. The investigation was expanding beyond the primary targets to include anyone who had participated in or been affected by the corruption network. The evening that had begun as a celebration of community service and charitable giving had become a reckoning with the reality of systematic corruption and betrayal. The people who had been honored for their civic contributions were being arrested for stealing from the very community they claimed to serve. I looked out at the remaining guests, seeing the mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief on their faces. Their comfortable assumptions about their community leaders had been shattered, replaced by the harsh reality that they had been systematically deceived and robbed by the people they trusted most. The woman they had dismissed as homeless or indigent had actually been their community's salvation, documenting crimes that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. My appearance, which they had mocked and looked down upon, had been my greatest asset in uncovering the truth about their corrupt leaders. Justice was finally being served, but the cost to the community would be enormous. Trust in local government would need to be rebuilt from scratch. Charitable organizations would need to demonstrate their integrity to regain public confidence. The legal system would need to review years of potentially corrupt decisions. As the federal agents completed their arrests and began processing the crime scene, I realized that my work was far from over. The evidence I had gathered would be crucial in prosecuting the criminal conspiracy, and I would likely spend months testifying in federal court about what I'd discovered. But tonight, watching the corrupt officials being led away in handcuffs, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The people who had stolen from their community were finally being held accountable. The woman they had overlooked and dismissed had brought them to justice. The ballroom was nearly empty now, with only federal agents, a few reporters, and some community members who were still processing what they had witnessed. The elegant decorations and expensive floral arrangements seemed incongruous with the harsh reality of what had been revealed. Miranda Walsh and Vivian Cross were among the last to leave, both women now facing the prospect of their husbands spending decades in federal prison. Their comfortable lives of social prominence and financial security were over, replaced by the nightmare of criminal proceedings and public disgrace. As I gathered my evidence files and prepared to leave with the federal agents, I reflected on how the evening had unfolded. The same people who had judged me for my appearance had been revealed as criminals or enablers of criminals. Their prejudice and arrogance had blinded them to the threat I represented, allowing me to document their crimes without detection.
The investigation that had begun with anonymous suspicions about municipal corruption had uncovered a criminal enterprise that reached into every aspect of community life. Justice had finally been served, but the work of rebuilding trust and integrity in Millbrook Heights was just beginning. The weeks following the charity gala arrests transformed Millbrook Heights into a media circus. News vans lined the streets outside City Hall, reporters camped outside the homes of arrested officials, and federal investigators continued their methodical examination of evidence I had spent months collecting. My small apartment became an unofficial command center where Agent Martinez and her team reviewed the thousands of documents, photographs, and recordings that would form the backbone of multiple federal prosecutions. The scope of the corruption became more apparent with each passing day. Bank records revealed that the criminal conspiracy had been operating for nearly 5 years, systematically siphoning money from city budgets, charitable organizations, and federal grant programs. The total amount stolen exceeded $8 million, making it one of the largest municipal corruption cases in the state's history.
My role as the undercover investigator who had exposed the conspiracy became public knowledge within days of the arrests. The transformation from overlooked server to celebrated whistleblower was surreal, but what struck me most was how differently people treated me once they knew who I really was. The same individuals who had dismissed me as homeless or indigent now sought me out for interviews, speaking engagements, and social invitations. The irony wasn't lost on me that my value to these people had nothing to do with any change in my character or capabilities. I was the same person who had been invisible to them just days earlier. The only difference was their knowledge of what I had accomplished, yet suddenly I was worthy of their attention and respect. Rebecca Hartwell contacted me 3 days after the arrests, requesting a private meeting to discuss what she had discovered about the Children's Foundation embezzlement. We met at a quiet restaurant outside Millbrook Heights, away from the media attention that had made normal life impossible for anyone connected to the investigation. "I can't believe how blind I was," Rebecca said, stirring her coffee with trembling hands. "Elizabeth Morrison seemed so dedicated to helping children. I trusted her completely when she asked me to investigate the missing funds." I had been documenting Dr. Morrison's activities for months before Rebecca became involved in her own investigation. The pediatrician's manipulation of Rebecca was sophisticated and calculated, using Rebecca's genuine concern for charity fraud to provide cover for her own criminal activities. "She was using you to identify potential problems with their embezzlement scheme," I explained, showing Rebecca some of the surveillance photos I had taken of Dr. Morrison's meetings with other conspiracy members. "Your accounting expertise helped them refine their money laundering operations while making it appear that they were cooperating with investigations into missing funds." The revelation devastated Rebecca. She had believed she was fighting corruption when she was actually helping to perfect it. Dr. Morrison had encouraged Rebecca's investigation precisely because it allowed them to identify and address weaknesses in their criminal operations before law enforcement could discover them. "The offshore accounts you identified were decoys," I continued, presenting financial records that showed the real scope of the embezzlement. The actual stolen money was being funneled through a much more complex network of shell companies and investment accounts. Your investigation helped them realize those decoy accounts were too obvious and needed to be eliminated. Rebecca stared at the financial documents in disbelief. The complexity of the money laundering operation was staggering, involving multiple banks, several countries, and dozens of fictitious business entities created solely to hide stolen money. Dr. Morrison had been operating at a level of financial sophistication that most people couldn't even comprehend. "How long were you watching me?" Rebecca asked, clearly trying to understand how she had become unwittingly involved in the investigation. "Your husband hired me to investigate suspected infidelity," I admitted, watching Rebecca's face register surprise and hurt. "He thought you were having an affair because of your secretive meetings and unusual behavior. What I discovered, instead, was that you were one of the few honest people in this entire conspiracy." The marriage counseling implications were significant, but they seemed minor compared to the magnitude of criminal activity that had been uncovered. Rebecca's secretive behavior had been motivated by her desire to protect charitable funds, not by marital infidelity. Her husband's suspicions had been completely misplaced.
Robert hired a private investigator to follow me? Rebecca's voice was barely audible as she processed this additional betrayal. He was concerned about your marriage, I said gently. He noticed you were stressed, secretive, and distracted. He didn't know you were trying to expose charity fraud. From his perspective, your behavior suggested you might be involved with someone else. The miscommunication between Rebecca and her husband illustrated how the corruption had affected even the marriages of honest people. The stress of discovering criminal activity and the need for secrecy about the investigation had created relationship problems that might never have existed otherwise. Rebecca's investigation into the missing charity funds had been more thorough than she realized. Her accounting expertise had identified discrepancies that went beyond the obvious embezzlement Dr. Morrison had allowed her to discover. The complete financial records Rebecca had compiled would be crucial evidence in prosecuting the conspiracy. The federal prosecutors want to meet with you, I told Rebecca, handing her Agent Martinez's business card. Your documentation of the charity fraud is some of the strongest evidence they have against Dr. Morrison and the other conspiracy members. Rebecca agreed to cooperate with the federal investigation, though she remained devastated by the realization that her efforts to help had actually aided the criminals she was trying to expose. Her experience illustrated the sophisticated manipulation tactics the conspiracy had used to maintain their operations while appearing to cooperate with oversight efforts. The media coverage of the arrests focused heavily on my role as the undercover investigator who had exposed the conspiracy. Television interviews, newspaper articles, and magazine profiles portrayed me as an unlikely hero who had brought down powerful corruption through careful observation and documentation. The narrative was compelling, but incomplete, focusing more on the dramatic revelation than on the systematic work that had made it possible. What the media coverage missed was the psychological toll of spending months documenting criminal activity while maintaining my undercover persona. Living with the knowledge that respected community leaders were stealing from vulnerable people while being unable to immediately stop their crimes had been emotionally exhausting. The isolation of undercover work had been particularly challenging. I couldn't discuss my discoveries with friends or family members without risking the investigation.
I had to maintain normal social interactions while secretly documenting the criminal activities of people who appeared to be pillars of the community. The contrast between public perception and private reality had been stark. Judge Walsh was celebrated for his judicial wisdom while privately selling legal decisions to the highest bidder. Police Chief Cross was praised for his commitment to public safety while secretly protecting criminals who paid for his services. Mayor Morrison was honored for his civic leadership while systematically stealing from the people he had sworn to serve. Dr. Morrison's case was particularly disturbing because her crimes involved stealing from sick children. The pediatrician had built her reputation on caring for vulnerable patients while simultaneously diverting money intended to provide them with medical care. The betrayal of trust was absolute and unforgivable. The conspiracy's sophistication became more apparent as federal investigators examined the evidence I had gathered. The criminal network had established legitimate-seeming businesses to launder stolen money, created complex financial structures to hide their activities, and maintained detailed records of their illegal transactions. Bank records showed that the conspirators had been careful to avoid obvious patterns that might attract attention from financial institutions or regulatory agencies. Their money laundering operations were spread across multiple states and several foreign countries, making detection and prosecution more difficult. The legal proceedings would be complex and lengthy, with federal prosecutors building cases against more than 20 individuals involved in various aspects of the conspiracy. The evidence I had gathered would be crucial, but the trials would require testimony from numerous witnesses and extensive financial analysis. Judge Walsh's judicial corruption would require a comprehensive review of every case that had appeared before his court during the period of his criminal activity. The state attorney general's office estimated that hundreds of legal decisions might need to be examined for potential misconduct, with the possibility that some cases would need to be retried.
Police Chief Cross's activities had compromised numerous criminal investigations and potentially allowed dangerous criminals to escape prosecution. The federal investigation was working to identify cases where his intervention had affected the outcomes of criminal proceedings. Mayor Morrison's embezzlement had affected multiple city departments and numerous public works projects. The financial damage to municipal operations would take years to fully assess and repair. The Children's Foundation embezzlement had direct victims whose medical care had been delayed or denied because stolen money wasn't available for treatment. Dr. Morrison's crimes had literally put children's lives at risk for personal financial gain. Community reaction to the arrests was mixed, with some residents expressing shock and betrayal, while others claimed they had suspected corruption for years. The revelation that extensive criminal activity had been occurring under their noses was devastating for a community that prided itself on civic virtue and honest government. Local business leaders who had unknowingly dealt with corrupt officials were reviewing their interactions to determine whether they had been victimized by the conspiracy. Construction companies that had lost bids to corrupt competitors were considering legal action to recover damages. Charitable organizations throughout the region were implementing new oversight procedures to prevent similar embezzlement schemes. The Children's Foundation scandal had damaged public trust in nonprofit organizations, requiring increased transparency and accountability measures. The psychological impact on community members who had trusted the corrupt officials was significant. Many residents felt personally betrayed by people they had respected and supported. The revelation that their charitable donations had been stolen was particularly devastating for donors who had sacrificed to support causes they believed in. Miranda Walsh and Vivian Cross became symbols of the conspiracy's collateral damage. Both women faced financial ruin as their husbands' assets were frozen pending forfeiture proceedings. Their social standing in the community collapsed overnight as their association with the corruption became public knowledge. The contrast between their previous arrogance and their current circumstances was stark. The women who had mocked my appearance and dismissed me as beneath their notice were now social pariahs whose husbands faced decades in federal prison. Miranda Walsh's attempts to distance herself from her husband's crimes were unsuccessful. Financial records showed that she had benefited directly from his corrupt activities, using bribery money to fund expensive vacations, luxury purchases, and investment accounts. Her claims of ignorance about the source of their wealth were contradicted by evidence of her involvement in money laundering activities. Vivian Cross faced similar challenges as investigators examined her knowledge of her husband's criminal activities. Bank records showed that she had made large cash deposits that coincided with her husband's bribery payments, suggesting she was aware of at least some aspects of his corruption. Both women hired expensive criminal defense attorneys, but their legal prospects were poor given the extensive evidence of their husbands' crimes and their own involvement in spending and hiding stolen money. The lifestyle they had maintained through corruption was about to become the evidence that would send them to prison. The federal investigation expanded beyond the primary conspirators to include examination of everyone who had benefited from the corrupt activities. Construction companies that had paid bribes for city contracts faced criminal charges and civil penalties. Law firms that had paid judges for favorable rulings were under investigation for professional misconduct and criminal conspiracy. Business leaders who had knowingly participated in corrupt schemes were discovering that their involvement had been documented in detail. The evidence I had gathered included recordings of conversations where business owners explicitly discussed bribery payments and other illegal activities. The scope of the investigation meant that virtually every major business and professional relationship in Millbrook Heights was under scrutiny. Federal agents were interviewing hundreds of witnesses and examining thousands of financial transactions to identify all participants in the corruption network. The psychological warfare aspect of the investigation was particularly effective. As news of each arrest spread, other potential targets became increasingly nervous about their own exposure. Several individuals voluntarily contacted federal prosecutors to discuss plea agreements rather than risk more serious charges. The cooperation agreements provided federal investigators with additional evidence and helped them understand the full scope of the conspiracy. Each new cooperating witness revealed additional crimes and implicated additional conspirators, creating a cascade effect that expanded the investigation far beyond its original scope. My role as the primary investigator meant that I was spending most of my time working with federal prosecutors to prepare for the upcoming trials. The evidence I had gathered was voluminous and complex, requiring careful organization and presentation to ensure successful prosecutions. The emotional toll of reliving months of investigation was significant.
Reviewing recordings of conversations where conspirators discussed stealing from children's medical funds was particularly difficult. The casual attitude the criminals displayed toward their victims' suffering was deeply disturbing. Agent Martinez worked closely with me to prepare for my testimony in the various criminal trials. The prosecution strategy required me to explain not just what I had discovered, but how I had discovered it, and why the evidence was reliable and complete. The defense attorneys for the accused conspirators were already attempting to discredit my investigation methods and question the reliability of the evidence I had gathered. They argued that my undercover work was deceptive and that the recordings I had made were obtained improperly. Federal prosecutors were confident that my investigation had been conducted legally and professionally. The evidence was obtained through legitimate surveillance techniques and careful documentation rather than illegal methods or entrapment. The legal challenges would be significant, but the evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, recorded conversations, surveillance photographs, and documentary proof provided multiple independent sources of confirmation for every aspect of the conspiracy. The community healing process was just beginning as residents tried to understand how such extensive corruption had been able to operate undetected for so long. The revelation that their trusted leaders had been systematically stealing from them required a fundamental reevaluation of their assumptions about local government and community organizations. Public meetings were held to discuss new oversight procedures and transparency measures that might prevent similar corruption in the future. Community leaders who had not been involved in the conspiracy were working to rebuild trust and establish new standards for accountability. The economic impact on Millbrook Heights was substantial. The cost of the federal investigation, legal proceedings, and financial remediation would affect the city budget for years. Property values declined as the corruption scandal made national news and damaged the community's reputation. Local businesses that had operated honestly were suffering from the negative publicity associated with the corruption scandal. Tourism decreased, property sales slowed, and some companies relocated to avoid association with the criminal conspiracy. The Children's Foundation faced particular challenges in rebuilding public trust and resuming its charitable mission. New leadership was implementing enhanced oversight procedures and working with federal investigators to recover stolen funds, but the damage to the organization's reputation would take years to repair. Educational institutions in Millbrook Heights were reviewing their relationships with city officials and examining whether any of their programs had been affected by the corruption. Several scholarship programs funded by the Children's Foundation had been suspended pending resolution of the embezzlement investigation. The long-term consequences of the corruption would affect Millbrook Heights for decades. The criminal trials alone would take several years to complete, with appeals potentially extending the legal proceedings even longer. My work as the investigator who had exposed the conspiracy was far from complete. Federal prosecutors estimated that I would be testifying in criminal trials for at least 2 years as they worked through cases against all the conspirators and their business associates. The personal satisfaction of seeing justice served was tempered by the recognition that the community I had helped protect was now facing years of difficult recovery and rebuilding. The corruption had caused damage that would take much longer to repair than it had taken to create.
2 years later, I stood in the same federal courthouse where I had testified in 17 separate criminal trials, watching the final sentencing hearing in the Millbrook Heights corruption cases. Judge Walsh received 28 years in federal prison. Police Chief Cross was sentenced to 32 years. Mayor Morrison and his wife each received 25 years. The sentences reflected the severity of their crimes and sent a clear message about the consequences of betraying public trust. The courtroom gallery was packed with community members who had been affected by the corruption. Elderly donors who had given their life savings to the Children's Foundation sat next to business owners who had lost contracts to corrupt bidders. The human cost of the conspiracy was visible in their faces as they watched justice being served. Miranda Walsh attended her husband's sentencing alone, her designer clothing replaced by a simple black dress that reflected her drastically changed circumstances. The woman who had once mocked my appearance now looked haggard and defeated, facing her own criminal charges for money laundering and conspiracy. Her conviction had resulted in a 7-year sentence, and her appeals had been unsuccessful. Vivian Cross was already serving her own 6-year sentence for conspiracy and money laundering. Her husband's sentencing proceeded without her presence, though her adult children attended to witness the conclusion of the legal proceedings that had destroyed their family. The Cross family home had been seized as part of criminal forfeiture proceedings, leaving the family financially devastated. Dr. Morrison's sentencing was particularly emotional because several families of children who had been denied medical care testified about the impact of her crimes. Parents described watching their children suffer because treatment funds had been diverted to personal accounts. The pediatrician showed no remorse during the proceedings, maintaining her innocence despite overwhelming evidence of her guilt. The total financial recovery from forfeiture proceedings exceeded $12 million, though much of the stolen money had been spent on luxury purchases that had depreciated in value. Federal prosecutors were continuing efforts to recover additional assets hidden in offshore accounts and shell companies established by the conspirators. Rebecca Hartwell had become an advocate for charity oversight and financial transparency following her unwitting involvement in the investigation. She established a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping other charitable institutions implement stronger financial controls and detect potential embezzlement. Her experience with the Children's Foundation had given her unique insights into how sophisticated criminals could manipulate well-meaning organizations. The psychological healing process for Rebecca had been lengthy and difficult. Learning that her efforts to expose charity fraud had actually helped perfect the criminals' money laundering operations had left her questioning her judgment and ability to trust others. Therapy had helped her understand that she had been manipulated by experts who specialized in exploiting people's desire to help others. Her marriage to Robert had survived the ordeal, though it required extensive counseling to rebuild trust and communication. Robert's decision to hire a private investigator to follow his wife had created lasting damage to their relationship, even though his suspicions had been completely unfounded. The couple had learned to address their concerns directly rather than resorting to surveillance and suspicion. The Millbrook Heights community had implemented extensive reforms to prevent future corruption. New oversight procedures required multiple signatures for financial transactions, regular external audits of all city departments, and public disclosure of all contracts and expenditures.
The city council had hired an independent ethics officer to monitor compliance with new transparency requirements. Charitable organizations throughout the region had adopted similar reforms, implementing enhanced financial controls and requiring board members to undergo background checks and ethics training. The Children's Foundation had been reconstituted under new leadership with strict oversight procedures that made embezzlement virtually impossible. Local businesses had also reformed the practices, with many companies adopting policies that prohibited any interactions with city officials that could be construed as attempts to influence government decisions. The business community had learned that corruption ultimately harmed everyone by creating unfair competition and undermining public trust. The media attention surrounding my role in exposing the conspiracy had led to numerous speaking opportunities and consulting requests from other communities concerned about potential corruption.
I had established a specialized private investigation practice focused on municipal corruption and nonprofit fraud, using the expertise I had gained during the Millbrook Heights investigation. The transition from undercover investigator to public figure had been challenging. The anonymity that had been crucial to my investigative work was now impossible, requiring me to develop new approaches to conducting investigations. My success in exposing the Millbrook Heights conspiracy had made me recognizable to potential targets, limiting my ability to work undercover. However, the experience had also opened new opportunities to help other communities identify and address corruption before it could cause extensive damage. I had consulted on investigations in 6 different states, helping to expose similar criminal conspiracies involving municipal officials and nonprofit organizations. The psychological impact of spending 2 years immersed in criminal proceedings had been significant. Testifying about the crimes I had documented required reliving months of investigation and maintaining professional composure while describing deeply disturbing criminal behavior. The emotional toll of the legal process had been unexpected and required professional counseling to manage effectively. The contrast between my current life and my experience during the undercover investigation was stark. The same people who had dismissed me as homeless or indigent now sought my expertise and treated me with respect and deference. The transformation illustrated how superficial judgments based on appearance could completely misrepresent someone's capabilities and value. The irony of my situation wasn't lost on me. My success as an investigator had always depended on being underestimated and overlooked by potential targets. Now that my capabilities were widely known, I had to develop new strategies for gathering information and documenting criminal activity. The financial rewards of my consulting work had allowed me to improve my living situation significantly, though I maintained a relatively modest lifestyle. The expensive clothing and luxury accessories that might signal success could actually hinder my effectiveness as an investigator by making me more noticeable and memorable to surveillance targets. Agent Martinez had been promoted to lead a new federal task force focused on municipal corruption, using the Millbrook Heights investigation as a model for identifying and prosecuting similar criminal conspiracies. The success of our collaboration had demonstrated the value of combining federal resources with skilled private investigators who could work undercover in local communities. The partnership between federal investigators and private contractors had proven particularly effective because private investigators could maintain long-term undercover operations without the bureaucratic constraints that limited federal agents. The flexibility to adapt investigative strategies based on developing intelligence had been crucial to the success of the Millbrook Heights operation. Federal prosecutors had used the evidence from my investigation to establish new legal precedents for prosecuting municipal corruption cases. The comprehensive documentation of the criminal conspiracy had provided a template for building similar cases against corrupt officials in other jurisdictions. The educational value of the Millbrook Heights case had led to its inclusion in training programs for federal investigators, prosecutors, and ethics officers. Law enforcement agencies across the country were studying the investigation methods and evidence-gathering techniques that had made the prosecutions successful. Academic institutions had also incorporated the case into their criminal justice and public administration curricula, using it to illustrate how corruption develops and how it can be detected and prevented. The comprehensive nature of the criminal conspiracy provided valuable lessons about the importance of oversight and transparency in government operations. The children whose medical care had been affected by Dr. Morrison's embezzlement were finally receiving the treatment they needed through a victim compensation fund established with recovered assets. The federal court had prioritized medical expenses in the restitution proceedings, ensuring that the most vulnerable victims received immediate assistance. Several children who had been denied treatment during the embezzlement period had suffered permanent health consequences that could have been prevented with timely medical intervention. The long-term impact of Dr. Morrison's crimes would affect these families for the rest of their lives, providing a sobering reminder of how corruption could cause irreparable harm to innocent victims. The victim impact statements during the sentencing hearings were heartbreaking, with parents describing watching their children suffer because money intended for medical care had been stolen for personal luxury purchases. The emotional testimony had clearly influenced the judge's sentencing decisions, resulting in maximum penalties for all the convicted conspirators.
The community's recovery had been slow but steady, with new leadership gradually rebuilding public trust in local government and charitable organizations. Property values had stabilized after the initial decline following the corruption scandal, and new businesses were beginning to locate in Millbrook Heights as confidence and honest government returned. The electoral consequences of the corruption scandal had been significant, with voters rejecting candidates associated with the previous administration and demanding increased transparency from all elected officials. The new city government had implemented reforms that exceeded federal requirements, demonstrating their commitment to preventing future corruption. Local news media had also reformed their practices, implementing more aggressive investigative reporting standards and dedicating resources to monitoring government activities. The revelation that extensive corruption had operated undetected for years had prompted journalists to examine their own role in providing oversight of public officials. The psychological impact on community members who had trusted the corrupt officials required professional counseling services and support groups to address feelings of betrayal and disillusionment. Many residents had lost faith in their ability to judge character and identify trustworthy leaders, requiring time and evidence of honest government to rebuild confidence. The charitable giving patterns in Millbrook Heights had been permanently affected by the embezzlement scandal, with donors implementing their own oversight procedures and demanding detailed financial reporting from any organization they supported. The Children's Foundation had to work extensively to demonstrate its reformed practices before donations returned to previous levels. The economic development consequences had been substantial, with several major employers relocating their operations to avoid association with the corruption scandal. The city launched an aggressive marketing campaign to rebuild its reputation and attract new businesses, emphasizing the reforms and oversight procedures that now protected against corruption. Educational institutions affiliated with Millbrook Heights had also been affected, with some students and faculty expressing concern about the community's reputation and values. The local university had implemented new ethics programs and community service requirements to demonstrate its commitment to honest leadership and civic responsibility. The regional impact of the corruption scandal had extended beyond Millbrook Heights, as other communities examined their own oversight procedures and implemented preventative measures. Several neighboring jurisdictions had hired external auditors to review their financial practices and ensure they weren't vulnerable to similar criminal conspiracies. Law enforcement agencies throughout the state had enhanced their training programs to improve detection of municipal corruption and financial crimes. The Millbrook Heights investigation had revealed investigative techniques and evidence-gathering methods that were being incorporated into standard operating procedures for corruption investigations. Professional associations for city officials, police officers, and judges had implemented enhanced ethics training and oversight procedures in response to the scandal.
The criminal convictions had prompted professional licensing boards to review their standards and implement stronger measures to identify and prevent misconduct. My role in exposing the conspiracy had led to recognition from several professional organizations and invitations to speak at conferences focused on government ethics and corruption prevention. The speaking engagements provided opportunities to share lessons learned from the investigation and help other communities implement preventative measures. The personal satisfaction of seeing justice served had been tempered by recognition of the extensive damage the corruption had caused to innocent victims and the broader community. The criminal convictions were important, but they couldn't undo the harm that had been inflicted on children who were denied medical care, donors who were robbed of their charitable contributions, and citizens who were betrayed by officials they trusted. The ongoing recovery process in Millbrook Heights provided daily reminders that preventing corruption was far more effective than prosecuting it after extensive damage had been done. The community's experience demonstrated the importance of maintaining vigilant oversight and implementing strong preventative measures rather than relying on post-corruption investigations and prosecutions. As I reflected on the investigation and its aftermath, I realized that the most important lesson wasn't about investigative techniques or legal procedures. It was about the danger of judging people based on superficial characteristics and the importance of looking beyond appearances to understand someone's true capabilities and intentions. The people who had dismissed me as homeless or indigent had made assumptions based on my clothing and appearance that completely misrepresented my abilities and knowledge. Their prejudice had made them careless, allowing me to document their criminal activities without detection. The corruption scandal had taught the community that appearances could be deceiving in both directions.
Respected officials who appeared trustworthy and dedicated were actually criminals who were stealing from the people they served. An unremarkable woman who appeared insignificant was actually the investigator who would bring them to justice. The lesson extended beyond the specific circumstances of the investigation to broader questions about how people judge and interact with each other. The assumptions and prejudices that had made my investigation possible were the same attitudes that allowed corruption to flourish by discouraging scrutiny of powerful and respected individuals. As I prepared to leave Millbrook Heights for a new investigation in another community, I carried with me the knowledge that justice had been served, but also the recognition that preventing corruption required ongoing vigilance and commitment to transparency and accountability. The woman they had called homeless had housed their secrets and delivered justice, but the real victory would come when communities learned to look beyond appearances and maintain the oversight necessary to prevent corruption from taking root in the first place. The investigative consulting firm I established after the Millbrook Heights case had grown into a specialized practice with offices in 3 states. The success of exposing the municipal corruption network had generated referrals from federal agencies, attorney general, and community organizations concerned about potential fraud in their jurisdictions. Each new case brought unique challenges that required adapting the investigative techniques I had developed during my undercover work. My reputation as the investigator who had brought down the Millbrook Heights conspiracy preceded me now, creating both opportunities and obstacles. Potential clients sought my expertise because of my proven track record, but targets of investigations were more likely to be suspicious of outsiders who might pose a threat to their criminal activities. The balance between visibility and effectiveness required constant adjustment of my investigative approaches. The staffing of my consulting firm reflected lessons learned from the Millbrook Heights experience. I hired investigators with diverse backgrounds who could blend into different social and professional environments. Former teachers could investigate educational corruption, retired police officers could examine law enforcement misconduct, and experienced accountants could identify financial fraud patterns that might escape detection by generalist investigators. Training new investigators required teaching them to overcome their assumptions about people and situations. The tendency to judge based on appearances had been crucial to my success in Millbrook Heights, but it needed to be consciously developed rather than accidentally stumbled upon. Role-playing exercises helped investigators practice maintaining their cover identities while gathering evidence of criminal activity. The psychological preparation for undercover work was as important as the technical training. Investigators needed to be comfortable with deception and able to compartmentalize their emotions while documenting disturbing criminal behavior. The stress of maintaining false identities while working alone in potentially dangerous situations required specific coping strategies and support systems. One of our most challenging cases involved investigating suspected embezzlement at a prestigious private school in Connecticut. The headmaster and several board members were allegedly diverting scholarship funds intended for underprivileged students into personal investment accounts. The investigation required our team to pose as wealthy parents, maintenance workers, and substitute teachers to document the scope of the criminal activity. The private school environment presented unique challenges because the targets were highly educated individuals who were skilled at detecting potential threats to their operations. Unlike the municipal officials in Millbrook Heights who had become complacent about oversight, the school administrators were paranoid about protecting their reputation and maintaining their criminal conspiracy. My role in the school investigation was to pose as a cleaning contractor hired to maintain the administrative offices after hours. The position provided access to financial documents, computer systems, and private conversations between conspirators who assumed they were unobserved. The irony of returning to a service role after achieving professional success wasn't lost on me, but the effectiveness of the approach made it worthwhile. The private school case revealed sophisticated money laundering operations that made the Millbrook Heights conspiracy appear simple by comparison. The embezzled scholarship funds were being channeled through multiple nonprofit organizations, offshore investment accounts, and shell companies established specifically to hide the stolen money. The complexity of the financial crimes required collaboration with forensic accountants and international banking experts. Documentation of the private school conspiracy took 8 months of careful investigation, during which our team gathered evidence of crimes involving more than $3 million in stolen scholarship funds. The scope of the embezzlement had prevented dozens of deserving students from receiving educational opportunities that could have changed their lives. The emotional impact of investigating crimes against students was particularly difficult for our team. Unlike the Millbrook Heights case, where the victims were primarily adult donors and taxpayers, the private school investigation involved children who had been denied educational opportunities because of adult greed. The personal stories of students who had been rejected from the school despite qualifying for scholarship assistance were heartbreaking. Federal prosecutors used our evidence to obtain convictions against the headmaster, 3 board members, and several co-conspirators involved in the money laundering operations. The sentences ranged from 12 to 20 years in federal prison, reflecting the serious nature of educational fraud and the vulnerability of the student victims. Recovery of the stolen scholarship funds allowed the school to establish a victim compensation program that provided educational assistance to students who had been denied opportunities because of the embezzlement. The program also implemented enhanced oversight procedures designed to prevent future financial crimes. The success of the private school investigation led to referrals for similar cases at other educational institutions. We discovered that educational fraud was more common than most people realized, with criminals targeting everything from public school districts to prestigious universities. The trust placed in educational leaders made them attractive targets for criminal conspiracies. Our investigation of a public school district in Ohio revealed a procurement fraud scheme involving millions of dollars in inflated contracts for construction, technology, and educational materials. District administrators were receiving kickback payments from vendors in exchange for awarding contracts to companies that submitted artificially high bids. The procurement fraud investigation required our team to pose as construction workers, technology consultants, and educational material suppliers to document the bidding processes and identify the participants in the criminal conspiracy. The evidence gathering was complicated by the involvement of multiple school districts and several dozen vendors across 3 states.
The complexity of multi-jurisdictional investigations required coordination with federal agencies, state attorneys general, and local prosecutors in multiple states. The evidence we gathered was used to support prosecutions in federal court as well as state criminal proceedings against various co-conspirators. One particularly disturbing case involved a nonprofit organization that provided services to elderly residents in assisted living facilities. The organization's leadership was embezzling funds intended to provide medical care, recreational activities, and nutritional support for vulnerable seniors. The investigation required our team to pose as healthcare workers, family members, and facility staff to document the scope of the criminal activity. The elderly care investigation was emotionally challenging because the victims were among society's most vulnerable individuals. Seniors who had trusted the nonprofit organization with their care were being denied essential services while their caregivers enriched themselves with stolen funds. The personal impact on elderly victims who suffered because of delayed medical care or inadequate nutrition was devastating. Our evidence led to federal prosecutions that resulted in convictions for conspiracy, elder abuse, and healthcare fraud. The sentences were enhanced because of the vulnerability of the victims and the abuse of positions of trust by the defendants. Recovery of stolen funds allowed the organization to resume providing essential services under new leadership. The pattern of targeting vulnerable populations appeared in many of our investigations. Criminals seemed to gravitate toward organizations that served children, elderly individuals, disabled persons, and other groups that had limited ability to detect or report criminal activity. The psychological profile of these offenders showed a willingness to exploit trust relationships and cause harm to innocent victims for personal financial gain. Our consulting firm developed specialized expertise in investigating crimes against vulnerable populations, working with federal agencies and advocacy organizations to identify and prosecute these particularly heinous criminal conspiracies. The work was emotionally demanding, but professionally rewarding because of the positive impact on potential victims. The success of our investigations had attracted attention from international law enforcement agencies interested in learning about our undercover techniques and evidence-gathering methods. I had been invited to speak at conferences in London, Toronto, and Sydney about the challenges of investigating sophisticated white-collar crime networks. The international perspective on corruption and fraud revealed the problems we were addressing in the United States existed in similar forms throughout the world. Criminal conspiracies targeting municipal governments, charitable organizations, and educational institutions appeared to be universal challenges that required coordinated law enforcement responses.
Collaboration with international investigators had led to several cases involving criminal networks that operated across national borders. Money laundering operations often involved multiple countries, making investigation and prosecution more complex, but also more important for protecting victims and deterring future crimes. One memorable international case involved a charitable organization that claimed to provide disaster relief in developing countries, but was actually diverting donated funds to personal accounts controlled by the organization's leadership. The investigation required coordination with law enforcement agencies in 6 countries and involved evidence gathering in locations ranging from New York to Bangladesh. The international disaster relief case illustrated the global scope of charitable fraud and the sophisticated methods criminals use to exploit donors' generosity and disaster victims' desperation. The evidence our team gathered supported prosecutions in multiple countries and led to recovery of funds that were redirected to legitimate relief organizations. The personal growth I experienced through these investigations was significant, but came with costs that weren't immediately apparent. The constant exposure to criminal behavior and victim suffering had psychological effects that required professional counseling and deliberate stress management strategies. The work was meaningful, but emotionally exhausting. Maintaining personal relationships while conducting long-term undercover investigations was particularly challenging. The secrecy required for successful investigations made it difficult to share experiences with friends and family members who couldn't understand the stress and ethical complexities of the work. Professional isolation was an occupational hazard that required conscious effort to overcome. The financial success of my consulting firm had provided security and resources that allowed me to be selective about cases and to turn down investigations that seemed ethically questionable or potentially dangerous. The freedom to choose clients and cases based on their merit rather than financial necessity was a significant improvement over my early career experiences. However, the transition from anonymity to public recognition continued to create challenges for undercover work. My face had appeared in numerous news articles and television interviews, making it more difficult to assume false identities without being recognized. The consulting firm had to rely increasingly on other investigators for fieldwork, while I focused on case strategy and evidence analysis. The mentoring of younger investigators became an important part of my professional responsibilities. Teaching others to recognize criminal behavior patterns, develop undercover personas, and maintain emotional equilibrium during disturbing investigations required reflecting on my own experiences and extracting lessons that could be systematically transmitted. The satisfaction of seeing justice served in multiple investigations was tempered by recognition that each successful prosecution represented only a small fraction of the criminal activity that remained undetected. For every conspiracy we exposed, there were likely dozens of others operating without oversight or detection. The preventative impact of our investigations was difficult to measure, but potentially more important than the specific prosecutions we supported. The publicity surrounding our cases and the sentences imposed on convicted criminals served as deterrents that might prevent others from engaging in similar criminal behavior. Educational outreach became an important component of our consulting practice, with speaking engagements at universities, professional conferences, and community organizations focused on helping people recognize and report potential criminal activity. The goal was to create a more aware and vigilant society that would be less vulnerable to sophisticated criminal conspiracies. The establishment of training programs for nonprofit organizations, municipal governments, and educational institutions helped implement preventative measures that could detect criminal activity before extensive damage occurred. The training emphasized the importance of oversight procedures, financial transparency, and suspicious activity reporting. As I reflected on the evolution of my career from the Millbrook Heights investigation to leading a successful consulting firm, the most important lesson remained the danger of judging people based on superficial characteristics. The criminals I'd encountered were often charming, well-educated, and socially prominent individuals who used their respectability as cover for predatory behavior. The flip side of that lesson was equally important. People who appeared unremarkable or were dismissed by others might possess capabilities and knowledge that could be crucial in fighting injustice. The same underestimation that had allowed me to gather evidence undetected was a bias that prevented society from recognizing and utilizing the full range of human potential. The ongoing work of investigating corruption and fraud required maintaining the perspective that appearances could be deceiving and that justice sometimes came from unexpected sources. The woman they had once called homeless had indeed housed their secrets, but more importantly, she had demonstrated that everyone deserved to be seen clearly rather than through the lens of prejudice and assumption. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.